I want to thank Lower Dome and Eleanor Cowan for our music this morning. We appreciate that. And thank Ann and Herb Wade for the treats. I appreciate that. Okay.
Greeters.
Oh, hey, our greeters, thank you very much.
Johnny and Mary.
Thank you, Johnny and Mary. Okay. Joys and concerns? Yes.
It's a joy to be back.
But we're glad you're back.
You notice he's not sitting by me anymore. Planned that.
Thank you. Brenda, I have one thing.
Yes.
The boy that we mentored for sixth grade, who's 24 now, who we thought was on the way to being a success, wound up in jail.
Oh,
So something he went and confessed to, that he had mentioned it to be out, but we bailed him out, and it's a serious charge.
oh, that's too bad.
I just want to say something. This family has done so much for that young man. Nobody could have done more, and they're such a Christian loving family, and I really give him a lot of credit for what he's done to this, and hopefully in the long run, you know, he will succeed and they'll be proud of him.
Yeah.
Any other announcements? Yes.
I just have to talk to y'all this morning a minute. I love every one of you. You all have been so precious to me. I've had a few ups and downs since I got here. But I especially need your prayer today. My son has had multiple myeloma for 7 years. And he's been treated at MD Anderson, lives in Houston. And he's gone through so many, 2 cell transplants and all. But he's so brave, and he's 63, and they had just about done everything they thought they could do there. And so we started looking for trials, new trials. There's trials going on in the different parts of the country. And he qualified for one of these new trials, which happens to be in Dallas. So that's one big prayer we've been praying for. So today he leaves to go up to Dallas, and he will have a stent put in today. Not a stent, a port. I'm sorry, yeah, a port. Tuesday they will go in and they will take his cells, his blood cells. This is a cancer of the blood cells. They'll take them out, and how they do this, I don't know, but they're going to ship them off up north to one of the laboratories that have something. They're going to equip these cells, make a little army out of them, tell them what to do, and then in 2 weeks, they'll put them back in him, and those little rascals will hopefully be the army that attacks all this myeloma. And I just ask you to pray that those little rascals will get in there and do their job. But we are so hopeful, and he's very hopeful too. So, but I ask for your, just think about it. It'll be 6 weeks really before they really know. Because they don't know when those little things go in there, they don't know what they're going to do.
What's his name?
His name is John Papa George. So I just had to ask y'all because I just feel like your prayers are answered. And I love the sermon this morning. It was so on prayer. And we hope it's going to be a yes. But thank you.
Yes, so keep John in your prayers, and we're hoping and praying that everything comes out all right. Okay.
Brenda?
I think we are deeply, deeply indebted to Eleanor and Annette for a great, great party.
I'm sorry I missed
You're great. And all the others who helped, and Sandra
it. Sandra and, yes,
and Jim, and
Yes.
it goes on and
Big-
on.
big round of applause, thank you very much.
A very special prayer for the comedians.
They need all the prayer they can get.
I received a card, well, like a small letter from Betty Brazier yesterday. And she is doing very well. She's liking it up in Fort Worth. She gets to see her family. She started going to Arbor Lawn United Methodist Church. So she said she misses the class. She hasn't found a Sunday school class yet that is like ours.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll go on, and Joe has the prayer this morning.
Oh, hey,
Yep, yep,
Jerry's going to do the announcement. He speaks better.
okay.
But you walk better. Well, Alice had asked me to remind everybody to get on this prayer list. And what we did was we acquired a tandem trailer. We're going to hook to the bishop's bus to heaven. So you're virtually guaranteed if his people get there, you will too. So.
All right.
So that's gonna go around, so sign that. Okay, Lucille. Yeah.
The carrying place report.
Yes, the Caring Place report on dated 3/11/18, Lucille gave this to me. We collected $275 in cash and 30 pounds of food. Yay!
I just wanted to say that you won't be as safe in that tandem. And if it comes unconnected, I bear no responsibility. Well, I'm substituting today for Zoe, who just has a little inner ear problem and dizziness. But she gave to me a hymn that she intended to read the words of. And I think you will remember as you hear them, and you can hum it in your own mind, that they kind of go with our party we had last week. It's really in our old Cokesbury hymnal, and it's to the tune of Danny Boy. But in our hymnal, it's titled, Above the Hills of Time. So I want to read the verse to you as a prelude for our prayer. Above the hills of time the cross is gleaming, fair as the sun when night has turned to day, and from its love pure light is richly streaming, to cleanse the heart and banish sin away. To this dear cross the eyes of men are turning, today as in the ages lost to sight, and so for thee, O Christ, men's hearts are yearning, as shipwrecked seamen yearn for morning light. May we pray. O God, we thank you for that morning light that is shared by so many of our friends around us, by our teacher Ken, and by so many that place themselves in an endearing relationship to us as we seek to walk the way of Christ. Bless us in this day and in this week, that we may truly be infiltrated with those blessings of assurance and faith that you give us so loudly in this Easter season. For all of this we ask in the Spirit and the name of our Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. I have a card for Patricia Ryman. Patricia Ryman, birthday card.
Congratulations.
Well, I certainly do want to second Alan's statement about the party the other night. You know, I believe I enjoyed that party more than any party we've had. It just, I guess it's because I'm part Irish. And,
It's because you're a party boy.
maybe so. But I thought that the program, you know, the jokes, which were pretty funny, and the wonderful songs played by Eleanor, I just thought it was just a lot of fun. And of course, the food was delicious as usual. And then, of course, the way Bishop Wilson ended the whole thing with that wonderful Irish prayer. I just thought that put a cap on everything. But it was indeed enjoyable. I want to say again that I'm thinking of Easter Sunday when we'll have our annual Easter program. And I hope to have some volunteers. I have one so far, but I need two more people who are willing to stand up and talk about, well, an Easter thought, a favorite Easter, a little bit of nostalgia maybe, a devotional about what Easter means to you, and so on. But I hope that you will, and that you will see me on that. Well, it so happens in the last week I received a dispatch. It's been a while from my Cajun connection in southeast Texas. And so I thought I would share with you his story, a true story that happened in Lake Charles, Louisiana. How many of you all have ever been through or in Lake Charles? Oh, well, almost all of you. You know that's the county seat of Calcasieu Parish. And in fact, that is exactly where the story takes place. It has to do with two Cajun buddies, Clovis and Thibodeau. Well, they were the best of friends there in Lake Charles, and they met at a cafe across the street from the courthouse there at Calcasieu Parish. They met there in this cafe twice a week for the darkest of chicory coffee and beignets. And they would get together and talk about whatever it was going on in their lives as friends do. And well, they were known as characters in that neighborhood. As an example, Thibodeau especially was known for wearing a pencil in his ear. You probably have known of people like that. Now, I was going to use this prop this morning, but I have a hearing aid and a pair of glasses, and therefore it just can't fit. And I really regret that, because I would like to have that just propped up here, demonstrating it to you. But I've known folks like this who, you know, walk around with a pencil behind their ear. Well, the reason Thibodeau did it is because 6 blocks away was a lumber yard, and he worked in this lumber yard, and he was always having to pull the pencil down, working with a customer on the number of feet or the number of inches of lumber that were needed. So it's indeed understandable that Thibodeau always did that. Well, one day, Clovis was sitting there drinking his coffee. He got there a little bit early, and all of a sudden, bursting through the door of the cafe was Thibodeau. And Thibodeau was holding his right ear with his hand. And he was obviously in some pain and very distraught. And he said, Clovis, you have to come with me over into the parking lot. I need you to come and help me find my ear. Clovis says, well, what on earth are you talking about? And he says, well, I had business over there, and when I got out to the parking lot, I got in a fight. There was an old redneck boy from Ole Miss still talking about that last football game. And well, we just had a fight, and he hit me so hard the side of the head that he knocked my ear off my head. And so you just have to come over to the parking lot and help me find my ear. And so, of course, Clovis jumped up, and they ran over there, and they started searching in the parking lot about where this fight took place. It was not an easy matter because, you know, the parking lot was about the same color of Thibodeau's ear. Well, at any rate, Clovis says, so he reached down and picked it up and said, Thibodeau, I have your ear, look. And Thibodeau looked at it and said, what is wrong with you, Clovis? Don't you know that my ear had a number 2 pencil on it? You'll have to pardon me my occasional jokes.
And you said that was a true story?
Now you will believe me when I teach my lesson, won't you? I'm afraid I've lost a little credibility. And I don't know that I had any to begin with. Not with this group, you know me too well. Well, for those of you who weren't here last week, what we're doing in these 3 weeks is thinking about Lent and getting into the spirit of Lent. And the way I'm doing it this year is tracing the steps of Jesus and the stories that we tell in our faith. These are stories that you know these stories, except I hope simply to remind you of them, and also perhaps to add a little depth here and there to them. At the end of last Sunday, well, we had talked about the Last Supper in the upper room, and so Jesus was parting with his disciples to leave. And but before they did, they sang hymns of praise, a hymn of praise. It's called the Hallel, and the Hallel is a combination of scriptures from Psalms 113 through 118. That is to say, this song is composed of verses from the Psalms. And so Jesus and his apostles stood before leaving the upper room and were singing these psalms. I read those, and they're beautiful. In fact, they give me an idea for a future lesson. Basically, they're hymns of praise to God. Beautiful. And I understand that they're still part of the Jewish Seder today in many homes, especially as an example on Friday night. I can just see Jesus and his apostles standing and singing this hymn. And it's very touching to think that Jesus and his disciples are standing and singing praises to God, and particularly in view of the fact that Jesus knew full good and well what he was facing. Well, when they finished singing, they left the room and took the downstairs staircase downstairs, and they started walking. It was a pretty long walk that they were going to have. They were going to walk across the Kidron Valley over into the Mount of Olives, and then on into the Garden of Gethsemane, which was part of that. For those of you who have been to the Holy Land, and several of you have, you no doubt have been to the Mount of Olives and to the garden. I would imagine that is an area that everyone would just automatically go to. I think it would be very meaningful to go there and to try to relive the experiences of Jesus. By the way, as I go through my lesson, I want to stop and say hello, Ann. It's good that you joined us. And I want to say to you and to anyone else here, if you have comments that would enrich the lesson, or if you have questions to confound me, well, please let me know.
Can I make one quick comment? They told us that the olive trees that are over in the Garden of Gethsemane area, they told us that those olive trees have the same roots that were there 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So it is, to me, it was just permeated with this sense and feeling of Christ and holiness, and I could have spent days there.
Well, I've seen pictures of them, and the tree trunks look very old and gnarled, so I'm not surprised to know that. Now, it helped Jesus very much to be with his disciples, who after all were his friends, his best friends. The fellowship of friends has always been an important aspect of our faith. The early Christians, as an example, the very earliest met, like as an example, after Pentecost. They were still meeting in the temple, and they would get together, just the Christians in the temple, and would meet together. Later, as the relationship between the Jews and the Christians soured, well, they met in homes. You will remember Lydia, the seller of purple, who welcomed Paul and his group into her house there in Philippi. This was his first step on European soil, and she made it possible by hosting Paul and his group into her house. And then after he came out of prison, broken and beaten, she still had them back in his house. And so the whole point is that friends have always been an important part of our faith. We too rely on our friends and small groups, such as the Contemporary Forum Sunday School class, do we not? And I have a wonderful quotation here from Adam Hamilton. After I read it, I just sat there in my study and looked at it, because I just thought it was such a beautiful, meaningful statement. He says, "We are spiritual friends who carry one another to Jesus." Well, what a statement that is. We in this classroom are spiritual friends who carry one another to Jesus. We walk together through loss and hardship because we are brothers and sisters in Christ. What a wonderful statement. And so Jesus and his friends are in the garden, Mount of Olives, and yes, it does contain olive trees. Jesus had been to the garden on numerous occasions. It was not far from Bethany, where he often went to visit with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. over on that side. And so, yes, he loved the garden and often brought his disciples there to pray and to meditate. Judas guessed correctly when he thought that that's probably where Jesus would go. He knew where to bring the soldiers. So as they entered the garden, Jesus asked his disciples to wait, to watch, and to pray. And then he took Peter, James, and John farther into the garden. Now, these three disciples were closest to Jesus. If you will recall, they were the three that he took up on the mount of what we now call the Mount of Transfiguration. They saw Jesus transfigured before their very eyes. So he took the three closest ones farther into the garden, and he asked them to watch and to pray. After he got to this location, the only thing I believe that you can say is that Jesus had an emotional collapse. As I have read and studied of this, that's what we would call it today, an emotional collapse. Now, we all have companions and friends with whom we can share our darkest moments, our saddest and most trying moments, and have those kinds of emotional collapses. And Jesus had these three men to try to understand, if you will, his moments of sorrow. He didn't ask for a favor. He didn't ask for advice. He just wanted to know that they were there. Now, Jesus said to them, I am deeply, deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here, and stay awake with me. And then he went even farther into the garden, and according to Matthew, he threw himself on the ground to pray. He prayed that if it were possible, that the hour might pass away from him. He says, Abba, Father. Abba, by the way, refers to a very personal type of an address to God. All things are possible unto thee, and so remove this cup from me. Take this cup of suffering away from me. And then after a long pause, he says, albeit not what I will, but what you will. It's in Matthew and Mark 14:35-36. Now, after this, he went back and he found his friends sleeping again. And he found them asleep. And he asked to them, he says, well, couldn't you stay awake for 1 hour? Couldn't you do that? And so he sized them up and looked at them. He realized that it had been a long, very long day. And then, of course, upstairs, they had eaten a lot of food. And they had had quite a bit of wine. And so it stood to reason that here it was, very late into the night, that they would be sleepy. And so he said, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, that is a statement that is used very often in the world, but very few of us have realized that those words were actually spoken by Jesus himself. It's really kind of a note of grace, I think, that Christ, looking at these three friends, would have that understanding about their physical condition. He surely knew that he would drink from the cup of suffering alone. He surely at this point understood that. So let me see, I'm just a little bit lost here. Yes, so he leaves them again to go back in to pray a little bit more. And this time, when he comes back, he finds them asleep again. And so he says, sleep on now and take your rest. The hour is at hand that the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Now, the idea that Jesus was in anguish, pleading with God, that it is unsettling to many of us. You know, we would think that Christ would be maybe braver, more courageous, wouldn't be knocking on his Father's door and asking that this cup be removed. And so we have some question about that. And I would like to offer three explanations that might help understand Jesus in this situation. The first is that there is no doubt but that the devil is tempting Jesus. You will recall, following the baptism of Jesus, immediately after the baptism, he went out into the desert where he was tempted by the devil sorely. Well, here, no doubt, is the devil again. And he is saying to Jesus, are you sure that there is not some other way? Is this that you're facing really necessary? You're only 33 years old. You've got so much more that you could do with your life. Well, why don't you flee now, get your disciples, and run back to Galilee, get out of here. You still have time. The devil tempting Jesus. Now, that's in the literature and in the commentaries. I have a little question in the margin. Do we actually today believe in the devil? Now, I have a feeling if I were to ask you the question personally that some of you would say, well, absolutely yes. And others of you would say, well, yes, but I think of the devil as the personification of evil, which is within all of us. So whether you want to see the devil as a true living force, such as God, or whether you want to see the devil as a part of your own soul, that's something that you would need to think about. I personally do not have a recommendation for you. I just have to think about it myself. But there's no question but that the doubts rose from within him, whether they were from without or within. But at any rate, Jesus certainly understood the temptation. It certainly would be tempting to get the heck out of there and get on the road back to Galilee. Then the other reason that Jesus would have been under such duress is that he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about Jerusalem. He was thinking about the temple and the Hebrew people. He knew that the temple was soon going to be destroyed. The beautiful temple planned by David and built by Solomon was about to be destroyed. You see, after the life of Christ, there were several, I don't know how many, but more than just a couple, of saviors who were trying to save Israel from the Roman Empire, which is to say, to get together an army of zealots and soldiers from the Jewish nation and try to overcome Rome and throw the Romans out and take back Israel for Israel. And in all cases they fell. Well, finally, about 35 years after the life of Christ, they tried that and it failed, and the Romans were simply sick and tired of it. And what they did, they came in, they brought their forces in from Rome, and they absolutely destroyed the temple. They destroyed all of Jerusalem. Not a brick was sitting on top of another brick when it was through, and they killed 1 million Jews. 1 million Jews. Jesus, as he was sitting there that night in the Mount of Olives, he could look up right across the way, right across the valley, and see the beautiful temple. And as he looked at it, he wept. He was so sorry to think that the temple in Jerusalem and his people were going to be coming to that end just in 2 or 3 decades. We know, in fact, just a few weeks before that time, in fact, well, I take it back, according to my notes, 4 days, we do have that scripture that said, and Jesus wept. He wasn't weeping for himself. He was weeping for his people and for Jerusalem and for the temple. Well, this was the second reason that Christ was under duress and under great, great sorrow. But the obvious reason for the agony of Jesus was the fact that, after all, Jesus was just a man. He was a man. We, after all, have always believed as the Christian church that in Jesus God had become fully human. Jesus was fully human, and so he was a person, and he was a man, and he knew what he was going to be facing. Well, what would you be feeling if you knew that in a few hours that you would be tortured? Yes, the Roman soldiers were going to be bringing him over to their military yard, and they were going to sock him with their fists and clubs and beat him. He would absolutely be physically nearly killed right there by the Roman soldiers. That he would be publicly humiliated, here put up on a cross on a thoroughfare where people would walk by and would see him and would shout at him, and would be subjected to one of the cruelest forms of punishment devised by a human being. Now, how would you feel as a man, as Jesus was, anticipating this? Yes, his soul was aggrieved, and he was full of sorrow. So, looking at these 3 points, surely you can understand why Jesus was deeply grieved, even to death, as Mark puts it. Perhaps all of us have felt that God has wanted us to do something that we didn't want to do, Now, of course, please understand that whatever we're talking about would be a very small matter compared to what Jesus was facing there. But I was thinking of examples of what that might be. Suppose in your younger years you felt the need to be a foreign missionary. You know, maybe in your college you went to a session or two or took a course, and the idea of being a foreign missionary to Brazil came to your mind, and the professor was really stressing it. Dixie and I had that experience in the seminary. Once I had decided that I did not want to be a Baptist pastor for all my life, the last thing that we really seriously looked at was being a missionary, and probably to Brazil. I had taken a mission course from Dr. Cal Guy, and he was on fire for missions. He felt, I thought it was rather insulting, I took it that way, that for a fellow to come to seminary and graduate in 3 years and go off and serve churches in the United States, you know, that really was not much of a sacrifice, and he almost scoffed at that. But he really was recruiting young men and their families to go off and serve Christ in a mission field. Suppose you really felt called to do that. You know, it would be tough if you didn't want to do it, if you didn't want to subject your family to that, as an example, or even yourself. Another example might be, suppose a member of your family is facing financial distress and needed $10,000. And you knew that there would never be a way that they could pay it back. And you had $10,000. Well, but still, $10,000 to you is quite a bit of money, right? And so here's something that you feel that you should do, but it's a difficult thing to sit down and write that check. So as we think about this thing that Jesus was going through, he finally says, not what I want, but what you want. Mark 14:36. He finally says to God in the garden, not what I want, but what you want. Adam Hamilton directs us to the covenant prayer in the Wesleyan tradition, and it begins, I am no longer my own, but thine. Put me to what thou wilt. In other words, not what I want, but what you want. Now, Ann and Joe, you all are probably familiar with that prayer. It said it was in the Wesleyan tradition. I've never heard that before, but I'm very touched by it. It says, it begins, I'm no longer my own, but thine. I am no longer mine, but thine.
Ken, do you have the access to the whole prayer?
I do not.
It's a beautiful prayer. The other words in it, prayer of John Wesley.
Oh, it is a prayer from John Wesley. I'm not surprised, because that certainly would have been John Wesley's attitude, right?
But it has some more very meaningful sentences in it.
Oh,
It's in the
well,
hymnal. I'm gonna see if I can find it. It's
Well,
in the dedication service.
but I don't want you to leave.
I'm not leaving.
Okay.
I'm not leaving. I thought we had a hymnal over here.
I do think that is
In the
a,
windowsill. Yeah, on the window.
I do think that that's a beautiful statement. I wish that I could make that statement and truly mean it. I don't know. I doubt if I'm really quite there yet. Maybe one day as I continue to grow. And now about between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday, Judas arrived in the garden. he was leading soldiers from the high priest, and they came with their lanterns and lamps and swords. And you have to ask, I wonder what Jesus must have thought to have seen his friend, his companion, the treasurer of the disciples. It is sometimes said that Jesus probably spent more time with Judas than anyone else because of that capacity, that job of his. And so, what must Christ have thought seeing Judas walking in with these soldiers, a contingent of Roman soldiers? Well, the question therefore comes, well, why did Judas betray Jesus? Well, there are 2 or 3 explanations. The one that I have heard most is that Judas, like the other disciples, never really understood Jesus. That they really believed that what he was about was like the others who were to follow, that he really was interested in raising up an army to move against Rome. But he was surely taking his time, in the opinion of Judas, and he was getting tired of it. And so he did this to force Jesus' hand to fight these guys. The apostles were there with swords, and to begin a rebellion, in other words. Another idea is that he was simply disillusioned with Jesus. Jesus said a lot of strange things to him that had nothing to do with revolution or a physical army. So he just was disillusioned. And third of all, of course, was that he was simply greedy for coins. Greedy for coins. So we don't know what was in the mind of this man, but he told the temple guards, "Arrest the man that I kissed." And he turned to Jesus and said, "Hello, Rabbi." And then he kissed him. Now, according to William Barclay, if you look at the Greek word, he didn't just peck him on the face. Surprisingly, it was a passionate kiss, and more than just one kiss, probably. Kissed him on the cheeks, and then moved off to the side. Now, to jump ahead of the narrative, in Matthew 27:3, we read these words. Later, after the garden, Judas saw that Jesus was condemned to die. That is to say, after the trial, when he was found guilty and sentenced by Pilate. He felt deep regret, and he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and said, "I did wrong because I betrayed an innocent man." And they replied, "What's it to us? That's your problem." And then Judas went out and hanged himself. That from Matthew. Looked at it that way, we really don't exactly know what to make of Judas. But we do know it was a horrendous act. Either it was a terrible act of sin or just a serious misjudgment on his part. As the arrest unfolded, Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of one of the soldiers. And Jesus told him, "Put up your swords, for all who take up the sword will perish by the sword." Another famous saying in our lifetime. And then he healed the soldier's ear. that kind of takes you back to Galilee, you know, like years before, when he healed so many people. Jesus, when he saw this poor soldier with his ear chopped off, just couldn't help but to heal the man. Now, after the arrest, well, Jesus was bound, and as their teacher was shackled and was being led off, the disciples fled. They got out of there. And Jesus stood watching as his friends deserted him, and his suffering was only beginning. So that is the lesson today. Next week, we will conclude the passion stories of our faith. I was wondering if we have any questions or comments on the lesson itself. Well, this is Lent, and I certainly hope that this next week will be meaningful to you, and thank you.